has anybody got any questions? And if there are any questions, then we'll take a couple at a time to give Dr. Osborne a chance to answer. Stuart, you can start.
Right, very interesting talk, illuminating. I'm interested in two things, really. I understand that the Christian Church very explicitly supported and approved of a slavery at the time. I don't know if there's any evidence that you've dug up in terms of local Christian churches being involved in that. I mean, I think it's also important to point out that the Muslim tradition, particularly their colonization of Spain, involved large-scale use of slaves. But just the other point, I'm a school teacher, a retired school teacher, and a recent meeting, a speaker talked about school history books, and it pointed out that there'd been a sort of excellent section of it on African kingdoms, and then it talked about Portuguese explorers arriving without any sort of real notion of that led to colonization and slavery. I don't know if you know anything about, how this issue is presented in school secondary textbooks. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelina, what we'll do is we'll take a few, and then if you can take a note, and we'll come back if that's okay. I don't know your name, but you've got Black Heritage Walks Network up there, so yours, sister.
Yes, hello there. Yes, so what are the next steps with this research in terms of what do you want to do with it? Because I'm under the understanding that there's next steps to this. I'd just like to know what they are. And then the other thing is as Black Heritage Walks Network, we've actually created a heritage walk around the gun quarter, and we narrate absolutely everything, Angela, that you have spoken about. Is there any way that we can support your research more as our organisation? Is it possible?
Thank you.
We'd love to take you on a walk, and our gun quarter walk.
I would love that.
Yeah, all of you.
I would have it on that at some point, to be honest.
Please.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to take Cecile, and then I'm going to come back to Angelina, and then I'll call you in after that, Jessica. Okay, Cecile, can you put your hand down? Black
Oh yes, sorry about that, Chair. Yes. Thank you, Chair. Angelina, thank you for an extremely powerful piece of research. In the Nottingham University, there's a parallel piece of work going on in terms of the links between the University of Nottingham, where I'm at, and the commercial sector, so the banking sector of Nottingham, and the sugarcane, etc., etc. And I just wondered whether there are any tentative suggestion from your research of how the manufacturing base that produce all sorts of instruments, etc., for the plantation, how the proceeds of that money also went into creating seats of learning within the region. I'm thinking here the links between the University of Birmingham, some of those great plantation owners, as part of their status, they bequeath money to create seats of learning. And I just wondered whether any tentative suggestion of that's happening within your region. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecile. Angelina?
Okay, thanks for those questions. The first gentleman that asked me about churches in the West Midlands and slavery. Well, yes, you're correct. The Church of England actually was the only, the Church of England certainly had plantations in Barbados, the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. They managed Codrington's plantations, and certainly they were in line with government, the government sort of position around not
really wanting to upset the plantation owners, so they really didn't do very much. It was more people like the Baptists, the London Missionary Society, the Moravians, that people really were really hostile to, as churches that they established on plantations in the Caribbean. I understand that some work is being done around looking at Fulham, the Bishops of London. I understand there's work that's being done there, but I think that is certainly an avenue. I think there's a heck of a lot to research on sort of the Church of England's complicity with slave ownership. I'm thinking of certainly. There's a historian, I think Mary Record, she's written about this quite a bit. When I remember reading her comments on this when she was writing about the rebellion in 1832 in Jamaica, the Baptist rebellion. You mentioned about school history books, and I think it's really important, which sounds great, that you need to contextualize the history of African peoples. Do not ever start with talking about enslavement. The history of African history spans as far back as Kemet and further than that. So it's really important to put the history of African people, African communities in its proper context. So learning about African kingdoms is really, really important. You mentioned Portuguese explorers. When Portuguese explorers came into, it's really important that we understand that Africa as we understand it is not just how it existed then. There were no borders as we understand them today. Portuguese explorers came and learned a lot from African civilizations. When they came into trade, they were trading on equal terms. And then the enslavement happened later, but they didn't go in there initially to capture and enslave people. But so that's how I understand it. But it's not my area of expertise. But what I have read is that they came in to trade. They came in to understand, and lots have been written, certainly by Portuguese and French and the British, about African civilizations and how interested those explorers were and how fascinated they were by the societies that they had established and created in that period. The next question was, what are the next steps with this research? How can you support me? Well, I first want people to read it, and I want to do more work. I want to be supported for us to find funding to continue to look at different aspects. Certainly, this is like a research that kind of gives a sort of overview. Each one of the sort of chapters that I looked at is worthy of so much more in-depth research. Okay, so if we agree on there's one particular aspect, it might be looking at merchant networks. We'll look at one thing, then we can look at that one thing. If we want to look at the foundries and the iron and the production of, sugarcane crushers and the technology, that's something else that we can look at. I'm happy to look at anything, and also hopeful that people read this research and are inspired by it to say, you know what, you've given me an idea, the seed of an idea to actually look into this aspect and to just run with it. I would love to attend one of your heritage walks. That would be an absolute honor. I would love that. I did a lot of work up in Birmingham. First, I did two projects. I did a project in 2016 on looking at African and Caribbean soldiers in the First World War. I did that with Churches Together in England, and I went around and gave some talks. I did I made a big exhibition on African and Caribbean soldiers who served the British West Indies Regiment and other African regiments and their experiences during the First World War. I did that working with West Midlands churches in Birmingham. And then I also wrote a history of a church, Holy Trinity Church in Birchfield. So I was going back and forth to Birmingham. So I really like it. I feel like it's a bit of my second home. And may I also say that your patties are awesome. So yeah, very, very tasty. Couldn't get enough of them. So yeah, I'm very, very fond of the Midlands. The next question was from Cecile. Now, this is also a very, very interesting, because I also thought about, what about Wolverhampton University? Okay, there is an excellent book. It's a book written by an African-American scholar called Ebony and Ivy, and he's researched the slavery links between American universities and slavery. Craig, something I'm looking at it now. Here it is. So this is Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder, and he's looking at Americans' oldest colleges and universities and their links to slavery. Somebody needs to write a book for English version. Okay, I'll do it. But you know, this is this idea. I mean, Nottingham University. I think Bristol were doing some work about their links. But you're absolutely right. How did these people who were manufacturers, people who were involved either directly or indirectly with transatlantic enslavement, what did they do with their money? Did they create seats of learning? But this is also very important, because this is another way that people tend to whitewash their involvement in slavery. Okay, this is how people tend to say, you know, don't focus on how I made the money, focus on what I've put it into, what I've contributed to. And I think that happened a lot, for example, with Edward Colston. And the fact that Edward Colston had invested through his philanthropic activities such a lot to Bristol, so many schools and buildings, almshouses, that people were more focused on that level of generosity to what actually how he made that money. And that is the thing that people were actually not able to relinquish, was that reality. They couldn't accept those two realities existing at the same time. Yes, he was a slave trader and he caused much misery. And yes, he also put a lot back into the city. But you need to talk about both. Yeah, both need to be acknowledged and explored. And it's like I said at the beginning of my talk about emotion, driving our narratives, wanting our narratives to be driven by our emotions, because we've learned one particular thing and we've become very invested in that idea. And it's very impossible and very difficult for us to let go of that idea and accept the other realities.
Okay, so I've got you, Penny. I've got a question I'm going to ask in a minute before I bring you in. There was somebody else who had their hand up as well, and they took it down, and I can't see them anymore. But so hopefully they'll put their hand back up again. Hopefully they'll put their hand back up. Oh, was it Jessica? Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
now let me ask my question first, as I'm in the chair. I'm going to abuse the position for a minute. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, Angelina, is resistance to enslavement, and obviously in particular in the Caribbean and across the Americas as well. But in this particular circumstance, in terms of the work that you've done, I'm particularly thinking about what was the kind of state of the, or it's probably something that's going to need more work, but I'm thinking, what was the state of the abolitionist movement across the Black country, if at all? Because for me, I know, as a historian as well, I've read histories about the support that people in some of the mills up in Lancashire gave to, during the Civil War, during the American Civil War. So they didn't want to accept the cotton from the southern states and so on. So I know about that, and I know about the support that people gave to the fight for independence in India. as well. But I'm just wondering if you could maybe reflect on what kind of examples of the abolitionist movement did you come across in your work. With that, I'm going to bring in Jessica, because I think she was from before, then Penny, then Matt, and then I'll come back to you, Angelina.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Angelina, for a fantastic talk.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to ask about, I was really interested by your example of the man who owned a single slave, and that economy, the kind of smaller scale slave owners. I'd just be interested to hear a little bit more about that, because I had understood it as, something where, one slave owner might have, many slaves. That was really interesting to me. Thanks again. Yeah.
Thanks, Jessica. Penny.
Yeah, thank you very much. For quite a number of years, I taught a module at the university where we looked at slave resistance, and particularly the resistance of women slaves, which had, until 20 or 30 years ago, been left out of the record. And I noticed that a lot of the undergraduates, this was a first year module, they got mixed up between the abolition or the making illegal the slave trade in the British Empire with the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And once we got over that problem, there was a danger that a number of students took up the idea that the British Empire was very, very good because they recognised earlier than anyone else that the slave trade was abhorrent. And so I don't think they thought that by the end of the module. I'm hoping they didn't. But it does make me question whether at all slavery in the British-owned Caribbean is taught in schools, or whether it's just American. There's a tendency, again, there was a tendency with undergraduates to get the British-owned Caribbean and the southern states of America mixed up. And I suppose that, because you mentioned, Angelina, a pamphlet that dated from an awful lot of years ago, then how can we almost guarantee that the work you're doing, the work you've used, is actually passed on if a generation is 10 years, then I actually know an awful lot of people 30 or 40 years younger than me that don't know the stuff that I learned at a particular stage. And one aspect that I'm thinking of is not just the economic and political and social impacts in the Caribbean of slavery, but in terms of an awful lot of the racism that exists today links to ideas which were used to justify slavery back in the 1700s, 1800s, etc.
Thanks, Penny. Just before I bring you in, Matt, just a little reminder to everybody, and probably myself as well, because I may have done it. It's just about how important terminology is, and enslavement is what we try and say now.
Yeah.
And I know we've all kind of, many of us have been brought up saying slavery and so on, but none of us were, my ancestors were not born slaves. They were enslaved by people. So if we could try and remember that would be great, everyone. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you so much, Angelina. That was a brilliant talk, and that report that you've put together is such a fantastic foundation, bringing all of that stuff into one place, like the potential that gives, you know, us as a community now to start thinking about the future is so important. So thank you for that. I guess my question builds on what we've already heard, which is like what next. And I think, you know, 100% agree that any more funding and support from Wolves to UC or anyone else is very important. But I was struck, I think I'm right, I remember one of the things in your report talking about the legacy of the 2007 bicentenary, where there were numerous projects across the region and across the UK. And I know that I've got documents where I've saved links to the stuff that was online a few years ago, and you go and visit it now, and those they've gone.
Yeah.
So, I mean, number one, it's like, how do we go about recapturing and not losing that stuff, that amazing work that was done, and how do we recover that? And then number two, it's about how do we make sure that whatever comes next with this work, that we don't lose that momentum again. Yeah. Because, you know, we could have a burst of really great energy, but it's about keeping that momentum, building the networks, and making sure that actually we build on the foundations and keep it going, and not let what happened 15 years ago where loads of great work happened and it dropped off. So yeah, any thoughts on that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Over to you, Angelina.
Okay. Right, so let's look at the first question. So Roger, you asked about resistance to enslavement and abolition in the Black country. Okay, so I confess that I didn't do any real work. I didn't look at abolitionism in the Black country. What I can say is that certainly in the period leading up to abolition of slavery in 1833, that certainly in Birmingham there were lots of women's groups like the Birmingham Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. There were a lot of women that got involved in the movement. I am 100% certain there was an abolitionist movement. People were doing abolitionism in the Black country, because, you know, this idea was, you know, the slavery, enslavement was a really, as people got more involved in the campaign, it was really divisive in terms that you were either on one side or you were on the other. Okay, and so it really did capture the imagination of everybody in the country. Okay, certainly in the 1780s and 1790s, it captured their imagination. People did get involved on a grand scale. So yes, that's work that needs to be done, and it may well be that somebody's already done something, some little bit of work around that. So in terms of your question to resistance in enslavement, sort of in general, I'm sort of taking it to mean you're talking about enslaved African workers, enslaved African people resisting enslavement. Yes, we know there's a lot of work that's been done. Certainly, like I said, I would refer you to Thomas Harding's book on white debt. He's writing about the 1823 Demerara Rebellion, which happened because in 1823, Parliament decides to pass a set of amelioration laws to ameliorate the condition of the enslaved, which sent slave owners into an absolute tizzy. Their argument being that if, you know, we start to treat these African enslaved people better, they're going to start to campaign and want to be liberated. It, you know, because as we know, to maintain a slave society, you have to maintain it with extreme violence and brutality, and to essentially dehumanize the people, to keep them in the state in which they're in. I can also say that there was not only resistance to enslavement in the Caribbean on a consistent basis from the moment it started. Resistance started from the moment people were captured, brought to the coast, taken over on slaving ships. Once they settled here, there was continuous resistance. There's a great book that's called Resisting the Slave Trade, that's written by, let me get that for you, you might want to read. It's edited by Sylvain Diouf. It's called Fighting the Slave Trade. It's a great book, a great resource. It very much informed when I was teaching a course on resistance to resistance and rebellion in the British Caribbean at SOAS. There's, what I might do, this might be a bit of a shameless plug, is that I might put together a little online course that some people might want to attend that might sort of address some of these, look at some of these parts of the history. So yeah, resistance. There was certainly, you talked about the Lancashire, that is definitely true. The workers who refused to work with the cotton that was being picked by enslaved workers in the United States. There is a strong tradition of resistance and support of people who were enslaved by many working class people in this country. That has to be acknowledged and celebrated and must not be forgotten. And at the same time, we must also remember that enslaved people fought diligently to have control over their own destiny. And I think about the Maroons, I think about Tacky's rebellion in 1760, I think about Buster's rebellion in 1816, and all the rebellions. So there were hundreds, some that never were carried out because they were found out. Those are the ones that we don't hear about, and we don't hear about also people who sometimes just refuse to work, who would run away, who would destroy and sabotage tools. All those little acts of resistance all add up to work being done by historians that say that for the most part, a lot of the times, slavery in the Caribbean was not as profitable often as people may think because of these little actions. So I hope that I'm able to, while I wasn't able to fully answer your question, Roger, I hope that gives you some, I hope that helps a little bit. The lady talked about single slave ownership, people owning only one enslaved person. I would like to learn more about this. I think that there's definitely scope for kind of asking, because yes, there were definitely people who had hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved people working in their plantations. But then you did have these smaller economies of these individuals that had one or two or three enslaved people who were bringing in and providing a steady income for that person. Okay, so that was happening with people who were living in the Caribbean, having one or two enslaved people. But as I said, this person was living in England and was receiving that income and was probably really relying on that income, okay, and not thinking about what that individual had to do to send that money, because it was so normalized. It was a normalized. I'm happy to, Jessica, to perhaps try and find out if there's anybody who's been doing this work, because I'm sure that small slave ownership is a study that people have been, have been looking into. I'm happy to kind of do a little bit of this, find out if there's anything on that. The question about, there's another question about slave resistance. I think that came from you, Penny. Can I refer you, there's a great book written by Stella Dadzey called A Kick in the Belly, talking about women and resisting. So that's Stella Dadzey. She's written some great books. She wrote The Heart of the Race back in the 80s. Yeah, she's written a book called A Kick in the Belly, and it's about women and resistance, resistance to enslavement. Then you talked a little bit about mixing up of the slave trade and slavery, and people kind of sort of thinking that Britain recognized before anybody else. It was important to, I remember David Cameron, when on his visit to Jamaica, saying, oh, we ended slavery, it's time to move on. Well, this is the whole point of the not understanding the history and also being attached to a particular narrative. And who's created that narrative? Well, the abolitionists created that narrative. Those people like Wilberforce and his sons, for example, really developed a cult of personality around William Wilberforce after his death. There's something that happened, but once, I think there's a quote by Eric Williams that says that it seems that Britain invented slavery so that they could abolish it. And, and that's what's really happened, that, people really misunderstand Britain's role. They think of it, the focus or the emphasis is on, well, we were the abolitionists and the abolitionist movement was instrumental in ending it. I don't disagree with that, but I think that we also have to consider all the other factors that were into play, and you cannot discount what was going on in the Caribbean. You cannot discount all the rebellions and the revolts that were happening that was causing so much destruction to these slave owners' property. For example, £1 million worth of damage during the Baptist Rebellion. Okay, it's at the basis, it's about trying to recoup those losses. That's what compensation was about, right? You want to recoup those losses of your property. You want to recoup those losses of damage to property. Okay, and that was really at the basis, at the heart of it. There's a Professor Cujo at Wesleyan College has written this whole book on his name. The name escapes me, of a Trinidadian planter who was a significant Trinidadian planter. His name totally out of my mind now. Who was part of the discussions that they were having with the British government on what was the terms of compensation, because we need to understand that the government had these individuals in the room to agree on how much money was going to be raised to compensate slave owners for their loss of property. That needs to be very clear in people's minds. It wasn't just about humanitarian, it's immoral to be enslaved, to enslave people. People were making huge amounts of money from it, and they didn't want to just give that up very quickly. It was a whole load of other factors that made them, came to the conclusion to end, to abolish slavery. And I certainly think that the Baptist Rebellion was a real significant factor, and it wasn't just about and also the abolitionist movement kind of came late to being more radical in its views. They were very much kind of gradualists for a very long time, and it wasn't until around the late 1820s where they started to say immediate abolition. So it was a real gradual, a very gradualist approach that we need to sort of, and because that information, as I said, if you've got that narrative that Britain ended slavery, okay, and that is a narrative that really suits you, you really can ride with that idea, you're going to find it very difficult to say, well, actually, it's a little bit more complex than that, okay? So people don't do nuance, is what I'm saying. It's either, it's going to be this or it's going to be that, and there's no grey areas in between. And third, so Matt, you asked what's next, and like you, I am always, having been involved in lots of activities around 2007. I was involved in an outreach working with Anti-Slavery International. We had these conferences around the country with organizations, with community organizations, with academics, saying, how can we keep the momentum going? Okay, and we came up with all these ideas, but a lot of it was partly about political will, because at that time, I think Gordon Brown, I think it might be Gordon Brown or Tony Blair, they sort of made it compulsory to teach it at Key Stage 3. And then it was removed by the subsequent governments. I think the Tory government said, no, we'll forget about that. That's not happening anymore. So, it's really important to be really to look at this history in a really critical way. And also there was no, support for teachers who really might find it really uncomfortable and difficult because they're not familiar with the subject themselves. There needs to be a lot of training. There needs to sort of understand what their own feelings are about this history as well, because the danger is, and my good friend Nadina Doherty, she's a sociologist of education, has done her work on all the things that can go wrong in the classroom. Yeah, and that's what we need to deal with, and but at the heart of it, I think, is about people really acknowledging, and we're not there at the moment, what's happening right now. I mean, Professor Corinne Fowler doing the work on colonial countryside, the poor woman's been trolled up and down, really, really, really attacked her for doing this important work. People are not, ready to hear it. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing it. I'm just saying that right now, the moment, certainly the moment around George Floyd's murder, I wasn't convinced personally that it was going to make any sort of fundamental lasting change. But, it was an important moment. I don't deny that. It's just it's the political will. It's the will to work with educationalists and people who write these books to make sure that they're presenting this in a really doing justice to the history. So there's really a lot to do, but we just got to keep on chipping away, that so many of us are doing in quiet ways, in little ways. That's just got to. We just don't give up. We just keep going. In terms of what's next, like I said, I think I would love to take this to the next stage and write something in much more in depth and much more substantial, and sort of work on getting, at the very least, getting this report in as many hands as possible, as many interested hands as possible. And I'm willing to sort of work with schools, work with teachers, work with whoever's interested in trying to deliver really good pedagogy on the history of enslavement, imperial history. Enslavement is one part of it, but it's that part that we're not talking about that's leading to so much erroneous information that's being disseminated at the moment.
Okay, thank you. These are the last two questions now then. Gabriella and then Simon, and then I'm going to hand over to Nick, who I think has got an announcement to make at the end as well. So Gabriella, please.
Great. Hello, Angelina. I really enjoyed reading, I think, as everyone has said, reading this report. So I'm mainly a writer based in Staffordshire and Newcastle under Lyme, and I'm currently doing a PhD, which is about Staffordshire's colonial connections and kind of reimagining the Black voice debris. So it was really great. So to kind of see someone, well, not port cities basically, because a lot of the research has been done on port cities, and even more so to see some of your list of different slave traders, especially those that had a single enslaved person, and especially seeing, I'm from Trinidad as well, so seeing someone that from this area had an enslaved African in Trinidad, and making a lot of what I'm finding and what I'm working with is silences. It raises a lot of questions, and even what you do find often is either not properly documented or recorded properly. And I know you were talking about lots of questions that you had, so I was just wondering, so how do you intend to work with these silences and dress those silences? Because for me as a creative writer, I suppose my methodology means that I can get to a certain point and then I could have to around it, but using the history as well. But for you as a historian...
Oh, missed that. Is it just me?
No, I think Gabriella.
Okay. Hi, Gabriella. Sorry, I missed the last part of what you said because you froze.
Essentially, in the archives, which I'm working in often. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
Yeah. So when I'm in the archives, a lot of what I'm working with is facts. And as someone who is predominantly a writer using history skills, because I'm doing a cultural studies PhD, I can use that and kind of go with that in a creative way. But for you as a historian, I'm really interested in how do you address and work with those silences. So if you don't get the evidenced answer to your questions, how do you go about addressing those silences, or do you simply leave them as questions?
Okay. Right, Simon. Thank you, Gabriella. Simon.
Thank you so much, Angelina. That was a really interesting talk, and thank you so much for all your hard work in bringing this research together. It's such a valuable thing, and I think it's definitely going to act as an inspiration for lots of people in the future. It's really fantastic. So I think my question actually kind of follows on from Gabriella's a little bit. It's about the ordinary people of the backcountry and about how they might respond to this sort of thing. So I just noticed that Patrick Vernon put something in the chat about responses to the Black Country flag, and that's an inevitable kind of thing that happens whenever this subject is raised. One of the things that I noticed that happens is that people will immediately say, well, my ancestors might have made chains, but they weren't involved in the slave trade or anything like that. They were it was not them. And I think that's a complicated subject for a lot of people, because in a kind of a post-industrial society like this, where a lot of people have a lot of pride in an industrial heritage and hard work, and kind of rightly so, they don't want to have that conversation with themselves or what it might mean that their ancestors were involved in that. So I guess my first part of my question is, how might we, as kind of a historical question, go about finding out how, if people knew that they were working on things that were going to go to the slave trade? I think they probably did a lot of the time. How would we find that out? And the second part of the question is about people in the present. How do we go about working with people to convince them that it's not something to shy away from, to talk about this in our ancestry, but to embrace it and think about it and think about how we can work towards a better future?
Thanks, Simon. I see Patrick's hand's gone up, and because he's my brother and is my vice chair on the Bernie Grant Trust, I'm going to let him ask a very, very, very brief question, Patrick, and then I'm going to go back to Angelina, and then it really all of this needs to be quick now because we're running over time. Patrick.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to commend can you hear me, everyone? I'd like to commend the Trades Council and Commission's report, and for my colleague and co-author, Hundred Buttons, Angelina, for doing this research work. It's someone that was born in Wolverhampton and was subjected to a narrow history of the Industrial Revolution, and making me feel guilty as a child about the history of enslavement. This process, this report, is the start of a journey for Wolverhampton, Black Country. I hope that there'll be inset day training for schools. And I think more importantly, we need to have a conversation. In London, there's conversations about history of enslavement. There's conversations in Bristol and in Liverpool. I hope this will be a proper, mature conversation. And I'm sure that this is the start of a process that everyone can get involved in. And I hope that the organisers of the Black Country Day flag also recognise this. I've had lots of dialogue with them over the years. I've been vilified by the media, and I've received hate mail. And I just hope we can have a mature conversation.
Thanks, brother. Right, Angelina, for brief responses to those questions, and then I'm going to bring Nick in.
Okay, so in response to Gabrielle's question about silences, okay, so the silences are often that we do not hear the voices of the enslaved. We don't know what they are, what their feelings or thoughts are about a particular event, because the people who are writing the records are the slave owners themselves, who are often not particularly interested in what, often not at all, or maybe, well, they're not documenting what they're enslaved. people are doing or thinking. So what I've often found is that you have to kind of read between the lines. So if they say something about an enslaved person, it might be, for example, Emma ate dirt today and was convulsing. What a stupid thing for a person to do. That doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to that person. That person might be trying to poison themselves. They may have some understanding of poisons within the earth, and they may be trying to kill themselves. So that means that can suggest, for example, that that person just does not want to be enslaved anymore, can no longer support the condition that they're in and are trying to end their life, okay? And that can be understood as an act of resistance, a resistance to enslavement, for example. So these are the kinds of things you've got, the kind of, when they do make comments, you kind of develop a kind of an ear, especially when you see certain things come up, and you can kind of understand, especially the types of language that they use, certainly around sex or sexual assault. It will be sort of euphemistically kind of described. So it's really kind of like reading between the lines and trying to understand what ancestors are trying to say while they're not being asked themselves. Similarly, it's also very difficult. For example, Thomas Harding's done this work on looking at slave testimony, enslaved people's testimony during in the aftermath of the rebellion. This we also have to treat with caution because it's being written by somebody else for them. But sometimes, again, you can get something out of what is being said if you understand the nature of resistance and rebellion. So if somebody just writes down so-and-so just totally destroyed that cart, yeah, he's not, why is he destroying that cart? Well, he's destroying that cart because he doesn't want to work with the damn cart. Do you know what I mean? So it's like they're not seeing it that way. The person who's documenting that event in wherever is not seeing it that way, but that person is doing something quite significant. They're telling you that they are pretty much fed up and really, not wanting to be in the situation that they're in. So this is the way that I try to approach these silences in the archives. There are other ways, and I can certainly. There are other historians who talk about this. The name escapes me right now, but I'm happy to provide that information for you. Simon, this is a tricky one, okay? And it goes back to what I said in my earlier comments about emotion driving the narrative, okay? And certainly, you say, somebody may say, yes, my ancestors made the chains, but that isn't me, that's my ancestors. And that's kind of like that sort of gap and that disconnect. Yes, that person that ancestor did that thing. If the ancestor made huge amounts and significant amount of money from doing that and was able to pass that down through generations, for example, to enable that person to have a certain amount of privilege that they wouldn't have had through becoming a self-made person through enslavement, then you have to accept that there is a link and a connection, because throughout the generations you have benefited from enslavement, maybe not directly, but perhaps indirectly. I mean, I just use this quite a big example, but you look at the Earl of Harewood, right? The Lachelle family were extraordinarily wealthy through their plantations in Barbados and as merchants trading to the West Indies. And by the 20th century, an Earl of Harewood is married into the royal family. Okay, they've made. I know that's a bit of an extreme example, but you can also have people who are upper middle class today because of their family going to Jamaica, establishing plantations, and that money is continually passed down. So you can't, there is a link you have benefited in some way, is my argument. Like I said, these are two realities that do exist at the same time. The Black country has a strong industrial heritage, but we also have to acknowledge that a lot of that heritage has links to transatlantic enslavement. I think because it's not direct, it's not about direct slave ownership, but it's about the Atlantic economy. And I think it's something that's separate, and I think it needs to be framed in that way. Of course, you're not going to get everybody who's going to accept that. You just not. They're just wanting. It's more important for them to hold on to invest in that particular narrative that they've learned. But what I hope that the report will do is for them to understand that it's impossible for you to have lived through the Atlantic economy, the Atlantic world, this country, and not have benefited in one way or another from enslavement. It was so pervasive, and everybody was involved in one way or another. Okay, I'm talking about trade and commerce. I'm not talking about like ordinary people, but ordinary people on the street were becoming huge consumers. They were consuming coffee and chocolate and sugar. This is when it came out of the provinces of people who were extraordinarily wealthy, who could afford sugar and could afford to drink coffee and could afford to drink tea. It's now everybody can have access to it. So like we've now created this huge sort of commercial enterprise here. So nobody comes out with their hands clean. It just means that some people will accept that and some people won't. It's a really tricky one to answer, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you, Angelina, and thank you, everybody. Can I ask everybody to join with me in thanking Angelina for what is a really great piece of work?
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming tonight and sitting with me and talking about this. And I really hope that the report has a much longer life and that it is inspired for people to sort of say, I'm going to do some more work on it. Because that was really, that was my intention. I was very intentional on that.
Thank you very much indeed.